Recently, I've been interested in the topic of whether the Democrats are the real racists. Because you see, that's kind of an interesting subject. Of course, the Democrats are going to deny that outright, and much of the left as well. And rather than talking specifically about Democrats, I actually want to talk about the left more broadly, as to whether they are, in fact, racist. And I frankly wouldn't disagree with the characterization of the left as racist. Kind of. I would suggest that the term racist to be applied to the left is not an inaccurate term, but is inoptimal. There are better ways to describe this, and I'm going to attempt to go through this today. You see, what caught my attention over the past week or so that I really wanted to talk about, and what brought this topic to the foreground of my head today over the past few days, is what was going on with Tim Scott over the last week. You see, this all starts with Biden and his joint address to Congress, where he did a kind of State of the Union, but kind of not, because it wasn't at the time that the State of the Union normally would be done, and it's just weird and all that. But Tim Scott, the Republican senator, did a rebuttal to the speech. And I'm not going to go over all of that here because that's not really my point. Rather, I want to go over the response to it, because the response was incredibly predictable. You see, many people were calling him an Uncle Tom or an Uncle Tim as a sort of play on that original term, and that is what immediately happened as that began trending on Twitter, with many, many, many tweets going over that exact thing. And, well, yeah, that sort of thing does pretend to a certain culture among the left to see black people as their own. You can go back to Joe Biden's "you ain't black if you don't vote for me" comments and other such comments as well, where you'll see Democrats really thinking that blacks essentially are owned by them, at least ideologically. And that is racism, or at least on the surface it seems to be racism. But of course, there is a certain amount of plausible deniability here. A lot of people will say, well, these are outliers, or Joe Biden was just having a stutter when he made these full sentences that don't make sense, or are explicitly racist. No. We can just wave all that away. But it gets a bit harder when you realize that this wasn't being done just on Twitter, but also by people at MSNBC saying he was after white approval, or even elected representatives such as a Texas Democrat calling him an Oreo. Essentially, he's white on the inside but black on the outside, which is just really funny. And it kind of confuses the terminology here, because how can you be black on the outside and white on the inside? This doesn't seem to make sense, especially with our traditional understanding of racism. If you compare this to how Hitler would think of things, or if you compare this to how the KKK would think of things, the KKK doesn't think of, oh, this guy is white on the inside or black on the inside, black on the inside and white on the outside, or Hitler doesn't think of, oh, he's Aryan on the outside but Jew on the inside, or vice versa. You don't see that sort of stuff from these sort of traditional racists. Well, you do on occasion, but not very often. Most of the time you see them clearly delineating between two groups where none the twain shall meet. It's all genetic. Nothing of the sort can be done with sort of the inside. It's the inside that's decided by the outside and that sort of stuff. But there seems to be a distinction here when it comes to how the left thinks of these things. And I wanted to think about this a bit more, and I went back to certain things, such as some of the ideological roots of the left, and one of the things I went to was actually Karl Marx, and the reason for this is because BLM claims to be trained Marxists, so it makes sense that their logic would be born out of a progression of Karl Marx's logic, and when I went to that place, I found certain parallels that were really telling. You see, Karl Marx was an anti-Semite, but he's not an anti-Semite in the sense that Hitler was an anti-Semite. In fact, he made a delineation between how someone like Hitler, though Hitler of course wasn't born at the time, but there were similar parties in Germany at the time, and how he viewed the Jews. You see, he called a particular German parties, or places like the Spectator and other places that he considered anti-Semites, to be Philistines. And the reason he designated them that way is because he saw them as ethnically anti-Semitic, whereas he saw himself as spiritually against Judaism, as spiritually anti-Semitic. There is actually a distinction there, despite them seeming to be very similar concepts. You see, Karl Marx, much in the vein of Mussolini, wasn't of the belief that Jews couldn't be communist. In fact, he was an ethnic Jew himself, though, of course, he never actually practiced the religion in his life. He believed, however, that Judaism was capitalism. He believed they were the same thing. His complaints about capitalism were his exact same complaints about Judaism. He called all goods money, which is inwardly circumcised Jews. It's something to that effect. And I'm not going to go over everything with regard to Karl Marx's anti-Semitism here. In fact, I have a video down in the description below from Tick History about that exact topic that is much more well-researched than this video is, and the guy just does good stuff. I suggest you watch it. It's a 30-minute long video, not too long, especially if you know how long his videos normally are, but it's really good, and I suggest you watch it to get a more full understanding of Karl Marx's disposition here. But we can move this perception of spiritually anti-Semitic versus ethnically anti-Semitic forward into the future to BLM, to the Democratic Party, to the more broad left. You see, the left is not ethnically anti-white. They're not ethnically racist at all, in fact. They are rather spiritually racist, spiritually anti-white. That's why the term whiteness exists. Because you see, whiteness is not a description of genetics. You know, my whiteness is not my skin color. They perceive my whiteness to be my belief in individualism. It would be things like the Protestant work ethic, and all of these sorts of character traits which have to do more with particularly English culture and can be applied to anyone. Anyone can have a Protestant work ethic. Anyone can be a capitalist. And that is how they portray whiteness. And it has happened over and over again. You remember that graph that was going around a few months ago, where they talked about things like Protestant work ethic, families, time, all of these things. That this was the Smithsonian, they were saying was a part of whiteness. And that is what they are against. They are spiritually anti-white. They're against these particular characteristics which they portray as being exclusively the domain of white people, though of course black people can be involved as well, as is evidenced with the Oreo comment from earlier. All of these things make a lot more sense when you portray it in this way. Of course, these sort of things, I'm not advocating this view of the world. I don't think the Protestant work ethic is an exclusively white idea, certainly not. The Asians follow it much better than many white people do, most white people, in fact. That's why they are the way they are, and anyone can apply it just as well as anyone else in terms of their race. It just depends on the individual, in my view. I'm not a collectivist. I'm not a huge fan of the idea of races at all. It's not substantial enough. I don't think there are human subspecies and that sort of stuff. So I don't agree with any of this stuff, but I want to be able to understand what all of these people are saying. And once you do understand what these people are saying, and once you do understand that they aren't anti-white in the sense that there can be white people who are anti-white in their book and can be on their side, once you understand that, a lot of their decision-making makes more sense, and you can more easily predict what they are going to do in the future. And that is what I suggest you do with this information. Predict what they're going to do in the future, because they are going to keep hammering these points home, and they're going to keep making these sorts of arguments. And if you don't understand what their arguments are, even if it is a subtle difference, like it is with spiritual racism versus ethnic racism, you're not going to be able to effectively combat them because they don't perceive themselves as racist. They can keep hammering on the point that, oh, no, we're anti-racist. If you keep calling them, well, no, you're just racist, without understanding that there is a subtle difference between their racism and the racism of the KKK or the racism of Hitler, if you don't understand that difference, and you aren't able to distinguish between the two, then you aren't going to be able to effectively argue against these people, and you're not going to be able to effectively convince other people to not be on their side. But once you do understand it, it becomes trivially easy to point out that all of these things are utterly ridiculous. That connecting capitalism to white people specifically is frankly stupid, and especially things like Protestant work ethic, time, the nuclear family, traditional family structures, and all that sort of stuff. It's ridiculous to connect these things. But they're going to do it. And if you don't understand why they're doing it, or what their thought processes are, you're not going to be effectively able to disconnect these things. And I suggest, really, and I want to drive this point home. Watch the video in the description about Karl Marx's thinking on this, because, once again, that video is more thorough than my video is. Mine's more of a cursory glance at these sorts of things, as opposed to a deep dive. And as well, understand how that video and those arguments that are made by Karl Marx there translate to what's going on today. Because a lot of these things are not necessarily new ideas in a broad sense, but are rather refreshes of old ones. They're remakes of Karl Marx ideas. Makes sense, considering all of these people are avowed Marxists themselves. So, that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. And if you enjoyed that video, do in fact subscribe down below, like the video, share it especially, because I want to get more views. I want to get my numbers up. And to that point as well, also go look down in the description for links to my other videos, or video sharing platforms, to links to places like Minds, Parler, and Gab, where I'll occasionally put my thoughts, and also where I'll put my videos, where I'll post out links to where they are. And on top of that, go and check out my locals, breakingonthedaily.locals.com. If you want to check out whatever I post there and get involved in the community, I want to start growing that up. I want to see that sort of thing grow as well, because I really want to support the platform of locals. It's a great place. So, that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. I'm KelKidman, this has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.